Let's talk now, though, to Professor Tim Luckhurst, former BBC Executive Principal of South College at Durham University, because we need to talk, of course, about the BBC. We spoke earlier about Gary Lineker's rolling of the eyes tweet about the BBC's decision that basically that was wrong for Martine Croxall to do what she did when she was presenting a news programme where she talked about how gleeful she was that Boris Johnson was in fact no longer running to be Prime Minister of the country once again. There is an organisation called Defund the BBC. This is the kind of thing that puts more pressure on the BBC because Martine's punishment was to be suspended from reading the news for about a week and a bit. She's back on today, so let's find out from Tim precisely what is going on inside the organisation he once worked in. Tim, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
It seems the pressure is kind of bearing down on the BBC. We had some radar figures just last week, and it seemed that every single BBC broadcasting outfit, radio-wise, has lost listeners and is losing listeners hand over fist. There's obviously a reason for that now, isn't there?
Well, yes, and I think that reason has got a great deal to do with very effective competition. BBC Radio has never faced such stiff competition. There are things like Times Radio, TalkTV, TalkRadio, etc., which now offer people alternative locations to hear interesting news and conversation. So, yeah, the BBC in radio terms has got a big challenge facing it.
Yes, it really has. But the problem for the BBC is that, yes, they are kind of tying themselves in knots over their impartiality rules, but people will see them saying, well, you broke the impartiality rules, but why don't you just go back on TV again 10 days later? And it seems as though, I mean, I'm not asking for people to be fired. I don't think people should be fired. But there's so many people, and Martine is one of them, who have only ever worked at the BBC, so they don't really have any frame of reference for anything else.
Well, I think you make a really fair point, Mike. The BBC is supposed to provide impartial news and information so that viewers can understand and engage with their world. And throughout most of its history, it's done that pretty well. But I think that there is a real issue now that almost all criticism of the BBC seems to be coming from one side, and that's from conservatives and people who don't adopt woke ideology. Yeah. And the mistakes that BBC presenters are making all seem to be because they are critical of the right, critical of the right, and appear to assume that everyone they know and everyone they're speaking to is therefore of a left-wing point of view. That's a really worrying position to be in. After all, it's not just Martine Croxall. This is what Emily Maitlis was accused of. This historically was what the BBC was accused of during the Falklands War. You might ask, is that because the Conservatives have been in power for a long time? I think perhaps there's another reason. I think the problem the BBC's got is that it employs an awful lot of young people in very senior positions. And those young people tend to come with the assumptions of their generation. You go into a newspaper office, when I was a newspaper editor after I left the BBC, and you'll find 21-year-olds working with 65-year-olds. I think that's a very healthy environment because it means it's like the real world. Yeah. The BBC needs to be very careful about gathering together people who share the same set of assumptions and think that those assumptions are universal. They're not.
And as I said, many of the people, and you will know this having worked there, who have only ever worked at the BBC, so they haven't really seen what commercial jobs are like, what commercial organisations are like, what different challenges you might face if you're not actually always able to walk up to the stationery cupboard and remove as much paper and pen as you want. In other places it's just not like that. And I know that's a bit of a simplistic point, but it's true.
No, it is up to a point true, Mike. People at the BBC tend to like working at the BBC. It's a very good employer and it has a fantastic reputation. It's famous around the world. It is an opportunity employer which gives good, talented people real chances to do fantastically interesting work. But yes, it's also the case that a lot of people join the BBC because they like the culture of the BBC. It's not just BBC lifers. It's also young people who are trained in the newspaper industry and decide they'd rather work at the BBC. But you have to ask the question, why? After all, there is also fantastically challenging journalism to be done outside the BBC, and there are very, very talented people working in other newsrooms, including, of course, your own.
Yes,
Mike.
indeed.
So it's valuable to try and remember.
Well, I mean, it's always worth putting a free advert out there. If anybody wants to come and work here, then by all means get in touch, because we're always looking for young, interesting and good people. And actually, contrary to popular belief, we don't look for a particular type of political belief at all. You know, it's all about, have you got the cojones to do the job? Can you do the job? And come and show us what you can do. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, there is a certain mindset that seems to go with the BBC. I've always talked about their kind of plan for diversity, because real diversity at the BBC would be for them to start hiring some working class kids, and they've said they're going to try and do that, but there's not really any evidence that they've started yet. Well,
I think that you're identifying a problem which works across many of our institutions in Britain at the moment. Like, there are ideological monocultures being created. We're a polarized society, a society in which people like to work with their own tribe and live within that tribe. And the problem with ideological monocultures, and I'm afraid they exist in universities as well, is that they are completely unchallenging. They create a delusionary impression that the world agrees with you, and that you're entirely safe and you can be surrounded only by those with whom you do agree. And that makes it impossible for people to disagree politely, which is, after all, one of the bedrocks of democracy. It really frightens me that we can't have a conversation in which I can say politely to somebody, look, I'm really terribly sorry, but I don't agree with you. I take a different set of views and I'd like to explain them. I'll always do it politely, but I find that these days, quite often, people will simply put their fingers in their ears and say, la, 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 I do not want to listen. Because they've never heard a view that contradicts their own.
No, because they're so busy blocking people that they disagree with. So that when in the virtual world, they never see those views, and they don't think they actually exist, and they don't really want them to exist, and they wish they wouldn't exist. Finally, what about Gary Lineker? Because he seems to now just be sort of poking Tim Davie in the eye every single chance he gets, and just saying, so what are you going to do about this? So he sends out a rolling eyes emoji at the BBC's own ruling that Martine Croxall was in fact breaching their guidelines.
I think that Gary Lineker is playing with fire. I admired him as a footballer. I admire him as a broadcaster. But the BBC has taken the view that because Gary Lineker is not involved directly in delivering news, the rules can be applied to him in a slightly more generous way than they would be to a news and current affairs broadcaster. I think that that's a very risky position to take, because Gary is a very high-profile BBC employee. He has enormous following. He's regarded as a leader of opinion, and as such, he shouldn't be playing games which suggest that he takes one ideological position, not least because there will be amongst his audience a very, very substantial proportion who don't share those views, who don't think that Martine Croxall's glee at Boris Johnson's withdrawal was a good thing, and who wonder about impartiality. Gary should worry about impartiality too. It's crucial to his own success. He should be rigorously impartial. The world is not instinctively left-wing. It's not instinctively right-wing either. It's instinctively a mixture of opinions.
Yes, and it's instinctively fair, I think, in many ways as well. Tim, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Tim Luckhurst, former BBC Executive Principal of South College at Durham University.